Welcome to Metanoia, my love, a series of conversations that honor free thinking, created by Nicholas Gada Thompson, my human clone. Dear Sebas, Sebastián Núñez Mardones, I didn't want to mess up, Núñez Mardones. Welcome, dear Sebas, to this third episode of the Metanoia Mon Amour podcast. The third one we're doing in Chile, the Chile 2024 edition. Thank you for coming.
No, first I want to thank you for inviting me. The truth is, there aren't many opportunities to suddenly touch on these themes of sports and culture. So, I appreciate this invitation to chat, and hopefully we enjoy a nice conversation around sports, but also other topics that could be relevant.
Here we go. I love that intro because, yes, we're going to touch on even surprising topics regarding the relationship or association with sports. You bring to the table topics related to sports, but also, well, you're a historian and an archivist, and you're obsessed with documentation, with original sources, primary sources, as they say in the jargon. And you've written a book that I want to start by celebrating. This book by Sebas is called 1910, and it's a book. Tell us a little bit about what it's about, Sebas.
Yes, well, before telling you about the book, I also want to take your word for what you mentioned before. I really do love documents, primary sources. My first exercise for writing this book and research was to avoid mistakes. Mistakes can persist over time. However, loving documents too much can hinder progress. That was always my first exercise, especially for writing this particular book and this research. Because, as you know, there are times when mistakes stick around over time, and there's no way to correct them. And of course, but there's also the other extreme, where you can get so caught up in loving documents, wanting everything to be the original, precise document, and just keep going and going, which often keeps you from making progress. It took me 7 years to finish the book. And also a bit related, I think, to that obsession of gathering documents. Like, for example, having all the birth certificates of the players that appear in the book, all the death certificates, and when you finish with the death certificates, you feel this emptiness, like, hey, what other documents am I missing? I want all the marriage certificates now. No, really. Yeah, it was a strange breakthrough, but it also opens the door to when you research a character thoroughly. It allows you to reach their descendants, their family, and eventually find a lot more information. Or suddenly, what happened to me on several occasions, surprising them with facts they didn't even know themselves. Oh, I had no idea that my grandfather played for the Chilean national team. I mean, it happened to me more than once during family interviews. So that richness was really, really good. Not just for the research of the book, but for me as a person, getting to know family stories, because not everything fits into the book. So, as you mentioned in your research, what's important is the journey, the labyrinth, getting in there. Because you say, this is literally like entering a labyrinth. Do I start at 2000, dive in head first, and then wonder how I'm going to get out of this? Because I was already in it. I didn't know when or how I was going to finish it. And of course, there comes a moment when you make a decision because, in the end, getting out of the labyrinth is a decision. I said, that's it for me. I was just about to ask you that.
And while we're at it, we can also dive a bit into the art and craft of writing. I'm going to take advantage of having you as an author to compare how we each approach that topic, but I want the audience to at least have a description. The book is called 1910, and it's about the Chilean national team from 1910.
Of course. It's the first Chilean national team that was formed in Chile with the aim of representing the Chilean colors, not just in soccer, but also in athletics and other disciplines. At the Mayan festivals in Argentina, which was the centenary of Argentina in 1910, that was the end. But obviously for that time, with a sport that wasn't very developed, this had more of a diplomatic mission, to show the country as a modern nation, sending champions, because that's also part of the proclamation that the sports associations have. Saying we're going to send our champions to compete across the Andes. There's a whole poetic theme to this journey to Argentina. The first sports delegation in the history of Chile crosses the Andes, and they do it because they also have the means to do so. Before, the journey across the Andes? Forget it. It was all about mules and walking. And you had to wait for the perfect weather to be able to travel. And the other option, which was super expensive, was through the Strait of Magellan, down below. But of course, sending a delegation of, 30 people by boat just wasn't financially feasible. But it turns out, back then, Chile and Argentina were having really good relations. In fact, there was talk of a trade exchange from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And in that context, which actually started much earlier, about 20 years before, was the construction of the Carril Lighthouse train. I was just about to ask you that. And that's the means they used, the Chilean national team and the athletes, to get to Buenos Aires, 52 hours by train from the Andes to Buenos Aires. It's an incredible journey, long and exhausting, and it also allows Chileans to see how majestic and amazing it is. Chile and Argentina cross it from sea to sea, from sea to sea. It's an incredible journey.
No, well, super interesting. Let's see. There's a lot here, like the obsession with archives, documentation, and primary sources. There's a love for sports that I'd like us to dive into a bit, especially the topic that interests me the most for the first chapter of our conversation, which is the more sociological aspect of the British in sports and soccer and how they see it strategically. Now let's get to that. But I like the labyrinth idea. I like that you used it, because in a way, writing a book is definitely about diving into the labyrinth, and I was just about to ask you that. What was for you the embrace of the Minotaur? So, what was that middle point where you reached the center and said, okay, from now on I'm going backward? Can you pinpoint it somewhere in the process? Or is it something more metaphorical, more poetic? When did you say, all right, this is it, and now the return could be? I'm just asking. It could be, all right, okay, now I need to find a book designer. I need to get someone to print it for me. I don't know how much it'll cost. What's your maze? How is your maze in that sense?
Yeah, the truth is that there were moments when the book was written in pieces.
Okay.
Suddenly I was writing a biography, because I had a normal job, working in IT. I did this at night, when I could. So the book was there, and when I finally said I want to actually make a book out of this and publish it, I realized it was terrible. I understood the book, but for most people, it might confuse them. It's not a typical football book. It describes a different kind of football with 5 forwards, 3 midfielders, 2 defenders. Contextualizing this was necessary to help readers understand its historical significance. Using it is unique because when you mention players, today it implies professionals whose lives revolve around football. So, all of these things had to be contextualized to reach the reader and put them in historical context, on the one hand, and secondly, so that they also understood the dimension of sport at that time. Using is very different, because one says they are already players. Today you talk about professional players, their life is football. If I talk about Alexis Sanchez, we'll discuss football, but these characters are different. Football is just a part. Some teach and do other things. I wanted to capture that in the book. So, football is just a small part of their lives, and there are guys who are teachers and work and live off other things. So, I wanted to weave that into the book, and for that, I started from way back. So I went and said, let's go to the origins of football in Chile for this whole process.
All right, and that's there. Let's go there, because as a historian, you can give us a bit of a rundown. Which you hinted at during that dinner. Today, which is Thursday, I think it was Tuesday or Monday. But I want this to be immortalized in the podcast. For that, I have a quote that I carefully selected from your insightful and thought-provoking book, which, in turn, quotes a grandson who was responsible for managing the microphone during a significant and impactful demonstration that took place at the historic San Martin Monument.
Carlos Silva Valtra is the one who wrote that. It's a wonderful text.
Yeah, who did you say?
From Carlos Silva Valtra.
Perfect.
He was a politician of that time and also a sports leader.
And of course, I'm going to read the first part because, in a way, it's like the conceptual and poetic raw material of what was behind it. That's the little bit I want you to tell us about the phenomenon in Great Britain and then how it was brought to Latin America. Carlos Silva Paltra says, let's not forget, gentlemen. He doesn't say ladies and gentlemen. Let's not forget that famous Latin saying, mens sana in corpore sano. And may the youth be strong in their physical constitution, for then their moral level will be unbeatable. Sports. Sports, in its various forms, serves as a silver bridge between the upper classes and those who are less fortunate, as they come together to compete equally without paying attention to the qualities or social conditions of each, but rather to the strengths and skills of the players tackling the tough social problem that worries policymakers in every country. Look at that. 114 years have gone by and we're still dealing with the same concerns. On the other hand, it draws individuals away from the centers of vice and alcoholism, since they are its most powerful enemies. And it instills in those who engage in sport habits of loyalty, of self-control, and stimulates the spirit of association until recently much neglected among us. Even darker times, and half like a prelude, like a line below, like an apology for sport. For me, everything this man says is exactly what it is. It is true. Now, I want you to take us, let's say, walk us through what you, as a historian, have researched and discovered. You have a clearer picture of how the phenomenon of sports unfolded. First, let's start here. They talked about the difference between play, sport, and sporting events. Physical activity or sporting event. Do you remember we talked about that distinction the other day?
Yeah, well, of course, in the conversation because, you see, the sports we know are the modern sports.
Okay.
Basically, those are the ones that, as Carlos Ibar mentioned, bring sports in its various forms. At the core, there are the disciplines, whether it's cycling. Back in the day, there was cycling, boxing, soccer, cricket, a variety of them. Tennis also has a variety. Polo was also played back then, all those. British sports, some. Older, some newer, but all meeting certain characteristics to be called a sport. And that's where the difference with play comes in. It's like, we're here chatting. There's a ball, and we go out to play. We play with the ball. But I'm not really practicing the sport itself, because it has to meet the characteristics of what a sport is.
Those are the rules.
Of course, the rules, the norms, it has to be regulated, or codified, as it's really called. Also, in the case of soccer, there's a referee, who also decides what the rules are when there's a disagreement, or enforces the regulations. On one hand, there are certain characteristics that need to be met, and on the other hand, there's the pleasure of wanting to do it, that it's voluntary. That's also important, because it turns it into a sport. Now, there's physical activity, which is another concept. Running, for example. When I go out to run, that's physical activity, outdoor activity, which is also related to health, but it's not something I've been practicing. It's not a sport. Sure, like some people say, going out to ride a bike or do cycling, playing ping pong, or practicing table tennis. Table tennis is the sport, Ping pong is about playing and hitting the ball. Sure, there's a rule there that says, hey, we play to 11 points. But the line for sports is vary. The line is blurry. Yeah, you can have free play, like they say in tennis, but still, he made the next distinction moving forward because we already have the rules. But there's something else, maybe just as important as the sport itself, which is competition. There is no sport. We already played soccer, we regulated everything, but then we have to compete.
No one keeps track of the goals.
Of course. So that's where federated sports come from as we know it, which is an association of clubs. In this case, the sport is born first, then the sports club or soccer club comes next, and after that, the next step would be the association.
It occurred to me, because I've been thinking about it since we talked a couple of days ago, that, in a way, you're connecting the different matches. There's a common thread that connects them. If you don't have a league, you don't have a championship. Each soccer match is a sport, but it's an individual event. It's a unit in itself. In a championship, on the other hand, you have a string of matches that are linked to each other.
Even the outcome, you add rules, more rules, you're adding rules, not just to the rules of the match, but to the competition.
There you go, from the competition, beyond the internal competition within each match, but from the global competition of this tournament, until you reach the round of 16, quarterfinals, semifinals of that tournament.
The very complexity of any human activity is reflected in sports. So we start with the game, then the sport becomes more complex after that. Hey, we're already playing matches, but how do we differentiate ourselves? And from there comes the identity. That's where the club is born. And from the club, these groups of clubs say, all right, but if we're going to play everything, we need to set schedules. And the association is born naturally. Sure. So you start to realize that this thing progresses and becomes more complex. But soccer associations, classic soccer, was founded in 1863, and it was established with the Football Association. So soccer was already being played. There were rules, the famous Cambridge rules. Right, with some differences. In that same meeting, the rugby folks left, and that's why soccer was born. Rugby and soccer. That's why there are two types of soccer at the core. At that time, the Football Association, which is the one that says, the one that creates the association, and rugby football, which is the one that breaks away, because they were from a rugby school. And they say, no, we're going to keep using our hands, because they didn't like the rule change.
Rugby and soccer split off. There's a split there.
That's where they split in the background. That's where they separate. And that's why soccer back then was called the Football Association, because they were the ones from the association that was created, and the ones from rugby. This split led to two sports. Rugby players set rules to keep using hands. So there you realize that there is a fork, and two sports emerged from one. And the rugby folks, they were the ones who set the rules to keep using their hands to maintain that, because they wanted to keep playing.
So let's say that the proto-sport was a sport that included using hands.
Using hands.
The proto in the sense of football, that's why. They called it football. Now it's foot, as in foot not. Ball as in ball foot.
But what I'm saying is, it gets more complex, and then they start adding to it, changing the rules to make for better competition. Well, it seems like every time they make a change to the rules of the sport, people feel like we're going backward or forward. But it is always the feeling of change that provokes that in people. You make a change to a rule, and people say, hey, but we've always played it this way. When we went from 2 points for a win to 3 points for a win, and a tie gives you 1. And if there's a point that gets lost, that's there too.
It was like a change.
A revolution. Hey, I don't get it. What happens with that point? Where is it? It's crazy. So all the changes, no matter how small, that are made to the competition, it's more common now to change the competition itself than to actually change the rules of soccer. But if you notice, every time there's a change, there's always someone who's going to say, yeah.
Does it transcend the sport? Does it transcend football?
And it also messes up the statistics, for example, because you have a way to measure and say, hey, look at this performance, it's this much. And suddenly they say it's no longer 2 points, now it's 3 points. And how do I relate all this? And it creates a whole situation with the people who follow the sport.
And from what I understand you were telling me the other day, there's a fourth, fifth, I've lost track, dimension of hyper-competition. Or the hyper-championship.
The hyper-professionalization, of course, because we already talked about the use and association. Yeah, that's true. We were already on the third derivative. And after that, there comes a time when football starts to be seen as an almost full-time activity. I mean, winning a championship involves resources. You pay for a ticket to go see the game because with that money, the clubs have better income. They build the stands. They have to construct the stadiums. I mean, the state isn't going to build stadiums or lend out a piece of land. But ultimately, soccer, especially soccer, starts to build infrastructure from the clubs themselves. I mean, in this case, there are very few clubs in Chile that have their own stadium. Colorado, the monumental stadium that the club built, maybe they got some help along the way, but we really don't know.
Donations.
Donations, of course. We don't know. And there are a couple more clubs, and the rest was done by the state with the bicentennial projects. But in general, there are very few clubs that have their own stadium. Unión Española, the Santa Laura, the Catholic Cathedral, the San Carlos de Apoquindo. But in general, the fields, when this all started, it was the clubs that fixed them up. They added stands. So, of course, all this money was creating better competition, a better show. Besides, it started to attract the masses. The stadiums began to fill up. I was talking about this in the 1920s, before professionalism. And of course, there's a point where there are resources, and the one who wins has more resources, and then money starts coming in, and at some point, the players also say, hey, I'm part of all this. How do I get compensated for having to spend time, training, for having to be good, for having to take care of myself? Besides taking care of themselves, what happens if there's an injury? We're amateurs. So, there comes a point where the next step starts to happen naturally. The professionalism that happened in England in 1888 took a long time. To arrive here, it took 40 years for professionalism to come to South America. 2001. And it happens for him. I mean, Argentina, if I'm not mistaken, in 31, Chile in 33, Uruguay in 32. I mean, all the countries start to professionalize in the 1930s. In fact, the first South American tournament in 35 was already played, with professional players, while the World Cup in 30 had amateur players. So there's a break. But it's not that violent either. It's the blurry line between professionalism and this amateurism. That's organic. Or this emerging professionalism, because by the 1930s it was an open secret. I mean, it was an absolute truth that there were players getting paid. They were being compensated, because of course, I want to have the best, so how do I entice them with money? Because they get paid.
Sure. What incentives can I offer them afterwards?
And that's where the phenomenon in the stands comes from. Because you see this spectacle, they pay the soccer players, they pay, I don't know, the coaching staff, they pay the coach, and I'm sitting in the stands thinking I'm supporting this activity because I pay for my ticket. I'm probably helping the club in some way. So the spectacle, then soccer stops being just a sport and turns into a show. And in that spectacle, I want better players. I demand from my club that they have better leaders too. Well, back then they were social clubs, so in some cases, there were elections, other clubs were outright taken over, and some didn't even have that. Today we see everything from a legal and juridical perspective, like how clubs exist. There are elections and all that, but back then it was all a blurry line. I mean, getting a legal personality and having legal elections. There wasn't a protocol, it was all done by a show of hands. The president was an important guy, an honorary one, who in the end would donate things for the club, like jerseys. They would choose an honorary president who was, I don't know, a mayor, an important person who would come and donate money. I mean, using what we understand today as a soccer club is a long-standing construction, a long-standing one. I mean, that's why it's impossible to say that a club was founded when it got legalized. A silly thing. I mean, the club is born when a group of people gets together and says, hey, let's form a soccer club and elect a board, at least a board, an identity, a name.
A name, sure. We give a name to a color palette.
Yeah, some did it, others didn't. Then they'd figure out what color we're going to play in, I don't know. Or whatever. There wasn't really a plan. It was more like, well, let's just wing it.
It's like those cities, the European cities where the old town is a labyrinth. There are both central and narrow streets, and then the planned cities are grid-like. But this is a maze. It's something that evolves. It's a dialogue between trial and error, like, let's go this way. This could be interesting.
And the founding dates, when we were founded, which one was actually the first and how. All clubs, I mean, not all, but a significant number of clubs have problems with that. To understand how blurry building a complex club is, the club is part of my community. Moving towards professionalism. Professionalism elevates identity beyond the neighborhood to larger leagues. Identity, I mean, the club is part of my community, my space. Right there. To move forward with the professionalism topic. And then, of course, as professionalism is born, the identity becomes like a higher level. It's no longer just the neighborhood team. It's a team from a larger space, the leagues and all that. Sure, or from the city, or it's the one that represents us in professionalism. And of course, there comes a moment when hyper-professionalism kicks in, which has already happened in the 70s and 80s, and that's where we're living now. I mean, a soccer player is an athlete. He's a guy who's a millionaire. I mean, like the classic saying goes, that's 22 millionaires on a field. When you watch a match in Europe, it's 22 millionaires and other multimillionaires on the field, and people follow them. And it seems silly, but it's real. I mean, there's hyper-professionalism. And it also happened when the most important clubs in Europe wanted to create another league, where they said, hey, if we're the best, why don't we just form a league among ourselves?
And outside of that, the G of soccer, let's say.
Sure, but it's the same process that happened before. When professionalism was born, a group of clubs that said, I want to keep carrying this, we are what we earn, we are the ones making this profitable. Let's separate from the amateurs and create professional leagues. In fact, if you read the history of professionalism, there's always a break. I mean, it's a group of clubs that say, hey, they never take a step. There's always a break. There's always a break, a dislocation. And the crazy thing is that it seems like a broken record. Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, it always happens the same way. It actually happened when the association was created, when another association was formed. You look at the history of Chilean and Argentine soccer, and it seems like it all happens in sync, like they're in cahoots. There's an association, a soccer team gets formed, it doesn't work out. There are two teams, one playing in Argentina, another playing in Chile, and one that went to Brazil. There are two teams, there are two associations. Everything separated, everything in breaks, but very, very parallel across the countries. In Uruguay, there's also a split. So you could see the phenomenon from a distance, like it's just a natural part of how the sport is created, how the club is formed, how the association comes together. I mean, the competition. The competition within the association, right. And then there are the breaks within the association, or even the breaks within the clubs themselves. So there's a natural rivalry when it comes to the sport, which is its supernatural aspect. And it is like a phenomenon, it is there. We are still living it in fact. Now, since there are choices and issues, there are always two sides. How do we move forward with sports? The AFA, for example, and the NFP itself as well.
I'm going to ask you a timely question because, at least in Argentina, this issue is really heated. And then I'd like to go back to it, I insist, because that's where the historical part you've been bringing up in sports comes in. But how does it connect with the development of social identity and all that, especially this thing about the rich and the poor, which I find fascinating. But before that, in Argentina, there's a debate going on because the possibility is opening up for a civil society, meaning that a club in Argentina isn't a corporation. Clubs are civil associations, they're foundations. And now there's the possibility that if the club decides, if the members vote and agree, they can transform into a corporation. I don't know how it is in Chile, if there are two options there, and the question would be, is one better than the other? The best thing is for each one to decide whether to become a corporation, whether it changes for the better or for the worse. What's your opinion on that?
Well, in Chile, they are corporations. In fact, to participate in professional football, you have to create or transform into a corporation. From that perspective, in Chile, it wasn't the members who decided this for their own reasons, but rather, it was a law.
Let it be a corporation.
And before that, there was a plan to turn soccer clubs into corporations. In other words, a tax that came about that the state created and it bankrupted the most important clubs in Chile, La U, and Colorado went bankrupt. They went bankrupt outright due to a tax debt. While it's true they weren't in the best economic conditions. In the case of La U, which I know very well, there was a tax debt, and I'll explain it to you super briefly. There was the DFL 1970, which basically regulated this issue of competitions. In that law, which is from 1970, it stated that bonuses and prizes were not taxed. So, they weren't taxed or money didn't have to be withheld. And it happened that from 1970 until 98, 99, the Internal Revenue Service said to pay the bonuses and prizes, and they paid them in full to the players. And that's what wasn't taxable, basically. Sure, and that pretty much stayed the same for a long time, because these things are like eternal. It's always like that. And what happened? In 1999, the state made it known, through the Internal Revenue Service and the General Treasury of the Republic. And they said, you know what, bonuses and prizes, you should have withheld the money from the players. Imagine, I don't know, the squad is huge. Colorado in the 90s was paying an impressive amount of money. La U too. So now all those bonuses and prizes for championships are taxed. And not only that, but I'm making it retroactive for 5 years. 5 years. 5 years. I mean, it was money that wasn't withheld. It's not like they stole it. And a huge debt was created for the clubs, which ultimately ended up going bankrupt. Of the two main ones, and the majority of the other clubs, Unión Española, Cobreloa, all had tax debts. And some still have them. And it's an eternal debt.
A push for a paradigm shift.
So, once it happened, because one says, okay, first step, we created the debt. Second step, whoa, the clubs are bankrupt. What's the solution? Anonymous society. But the funny thing is that in 1998, the former President Pinera, who passed away not long ago, had already presented a parliamentary motion for the creation of the Anonymous Society. So, Pinera presents the motion in 98 and in 99, a little path. And that's where the process also comes in. I don't know, I tell you there are good things about the Anonymous Society, like if players get paid on time. As long as there are no penalties and all that. But it also happened that with the Anonymous Society, there are people in football who haven't been paid. That's why now they ask for receipts. They have to leave a receipt inside, because if not, the club won't pay. They take it from that receipt or they have to deal with the consequences. There are all kinds of mechanisms to meet the needs of the football players, the workers, etc. But also within the framework of the Anonymous Society, it has happened that clubs have been disaffiliated. Concepcion, in 2016, stopped paying salaries, everyone got voted out, and there it was. Debts, and it was terrible. I mean, whoever wants to cheat is always going to cheat. But the Anonymous Society wasn't something voluntary in Chilean football. And I do think that the objectives get distorted. I don't want to talk about it administratively, but rather about those who are inside the clubs. What's the goal? Because in the social club, with all its sayings, its lights and shadows, there was always one objective: to compete, to win, to be better, to take care of the club, its assets, etc. But with the Anonymous Society, the goal of an Anonymous Society is to make money. That's the objective. I'm not saying to the leaders who are part of that Anonymous Society that no, what you want is to make money. No, the legal entity was created for that. What are investment funds for? To make money. And if an investment fund gets involved in a club, because that's what's going to happen when it comes to the Anonymous Society, it's to make money. So in the end, you end up saying, okay, how do I make money? Selling players. Not even developing them, just selling players, because the goal is to sell them. Now, if you can form it and become a millionaire with it, fine. But if that's not the case, use it. I'll bring in a player, I'll check everything. I'll sell it for a high price, he'll check everything. I'll sell it for a high price, I'll make a decent squad. I'll get the money from television, the image rights, I'll sell the shirts. So in the end, the Anonymous Society says, alright, let's sum it all up. How do I make money from this? Everywhere you go, they'll tell you that the Anonymous Society is bad, that the leaders are from this team or that team, and we come here. But the entity is set up to make money, and those who are involved are there for that. So the main goal gets lost, which is to help the club grow. But the entity is set up to make money, and those who are there. So the main goal gets lost, which is to help the club grow. In what? The dimensions that the club has, which is to win the competition. No one can say that's not a goal. The goal of every soccer club is to win the competition they participate in. And the other ones that exist, the international ones, participate. And obviously, there's also the other dimension that they hardly see, and keep in mind, they didn't see it back in the days of the corporations either, which is to protect the tangible and intangible heritage of a club, its colors, its identity. I would say that wasn't done before either, because now everyone says, hey, the corporation forgot about the heritage, the history. It's a lie. Back in the days of the corporations, they didn't care about that either. Very little. Maybe at some point, a leader was the one in charge of things, the books. But here in Chile, in general, there's very little information, very little that gets preserved. Everything gets lost, everything gets thrown away.
The way you tell it, it's almost not a metaphor, but a miniature example, in quotes, because they are still huge institutions, with a lot of people involved, but it seems like a demonstration of how a society works. 2. 1. The state starts from a series of logical circumstances. Well, there are more of us. We need to organize. Some people start to specialize. And within the social system, there has to be at least some kind of health, some kind of education. We systematize that. We socialize it. Someone has to audit it, manage it, and then it just keeps growing. And each time, the identity gets stronger. The identity of countries, let's say, as historically faced risks. There are times when citizens feel more patriotic, or more nationalistic, or more connected to their land. There are moments when less is, in a way, well, maybe it's even something inevitably human.
Absolutely. In fact, it really shows when you say you're in some place, or you're abroad, and you run into a Chilean. Right off the bat, it's like, hey, we're from the same country. But you're in, I don't know, your hometown, Buenos Aires, and you bump into someone from your neighborhood. And from that neighborhood, if you were from the same street, in the end, it's like we were practically neighbors. So in the end, you always try to find points of connection with the other person, right? And the sports club, that's also what creates. It creates a social identity space. And that's why. We become fans and we identify with a color, and we are super strange fans. You join a soccer club, and you become a fan of a color, and your clothes are that color. A lot of times. It has a logo, and that logo is everywhere. You draw it when you're a kid, and then you buy it. There's a whole issue that goes beyond the personal. But that's very human. Humans always look for ways to connect with others in society through shared interests or things in common. And within the club, which I see as such, it's the closest thing to a dogma, a religion where you have rituals, where you have traditions. And I would even say beliefs, liturgies, beliefs. Just like the fans create their own culture, we do too, right? He put up the monumental, Pinochet gave it to him, there's no proof. He put this up, he put that up, and on the other side, they throw the same thing at you. It's part of the culture. And no one cares if it's true or false. It's part of your truths within your dogma, and that also makes it irrational. Fanaticism blinds you. Watching a game lowers your score by 30 points. And that's why we talk about fanaticism, because it really blinds you. Going to the stadium and watching a game, it drops your score by 30 points the moment you step inside and start shouting and cheering. Everything you have inside, all those bottled up emotions, it's a space, the stadium. And practicing it too, obviously. Now we see it from the perspective of the fan of the spectacle, but that's also something that gets practiced. And there are people who go to the stadium and practice it afterwards. And this is like a whole therapy, really, participating and being part of a community, and nobody wants to be left out of that community. It's like kids in school. I mean, it's natural. It's the most natural thing in the world. You're in a class and you want to belong to a group.
Sure, first they ask your name. Then the second thing is, which team do you support, basically.
Of course, in Argentina, it's exactly that kind of demonstration.
Even those of us who never really paid much attention to it as kids. But still, it was so ingrained that, at that moment, you don't have your own identity, so you look for a sense of belonging. Well, there's something kind of childish about it, you know, but it's more about the emotional side, not because it's childish like kids, but kids are really marked by it.
And it's like, being a fan is also a way of going back to being a kid. Because, you know, colors. It really is childish. In fact, just imagine that the violent fan groups are the kind of bad guys who are capable of killing people over a banner. And if you look at it from the perspective of normalcy, you say, how can they kill each other over a piece of cloth?
Over cloth.
So, this topic also loses its logic. Well, getting into the topic of the violent fan groups is really another issue, no. But yeah, it's also a bit like going back to being a kid. Going back to being more primitive, I think. Going back to a certain origin. And that's what soccer allows you to do. Because just imagine you shouting in the street like you did in the stadium, cursing at the referee. I mean, take it out of context and that guy's crazy. You put him on the field, fan. And you just crack up, like, hey ref. And you throw a curse at him, and they even laugh. So yeah, out of context, it's crazy.
It's crazy, exactly. It's good. And then there's the whole tribal thing in the feeling. From the times I'd been to the stadium. First of all, it's really fun. It's super fun to go, especially when you're not so emotionally tangled up in what's happening, but you see it as a show, period, you know. If you're too worried about winning or losing, you might not enjoy it as much, but I think people still go and enjoy even when things are going badly. It's like the player who sees his horse losing. And that fury, that panic, is also part of what he's looking for. They say that the usant, the gambling addict, wants to lose. He doesn't want to win in his subconscious. Going back to the stadium. I've seen it differently. But I've also noticed it, for example, in what happens at electronic music parties, where the crowd, the self dissolves, and suddenly what was a series or a group of individuals turns into a macroorganism, almost like a beehive, like an anthill, where everyone is, in the case of the party, moving to the same rhythm, doing almost the same movement.
I mean, you put it better. I said it takes 30 points off your intellectual surface. But really, it's that, in the absence of the self. To participate in a fan group, where everyone sings and everyone knows the song, and you're part of a whole. That disconnects you from the self. For a bit, because deep down, being yourself, being an individual is exhausting. It is exhausting, exactly.
And disconnecting is therapeutic too. You had a fight with your boss. You didn't have the guts to curse him out, so you go to the game and you let it all out on the referee or the opposing team. At least, well, you might avoid doing the same with your family and all, right? It's better on the field than in the domestic world. There's a sublimation. Let's say, Freud would say, Zweitausendien, the fan, not just sports is a type of sublimation like art is, but the fan sublimates a whole bunch of things.
But notice that we're talking about the phenomenon now, because this is like the fifth derivative of sports. We're not talking about the sport now, talking about what happens off-field.
Exactly.
So if you look at it, in the end, the phenomenon is much broader. Imagine how, as we were talking about yesterday, a bad leader exerts power over 300 families who are the workers at the bottom. Imagine a soccer match, the significance it has when, Boca plays River. The impact on half the population of Argentina. So, it's really crazy. And that's where the cultural impact comes in, which, while it's true that it can be measured and seen, is much deeper. A political scandal happens. And right after the classic match. Nobody cares about the scandal. They're just like, all right, let's go. What's gonna happen in the game? That shows. We should be much more rigorous when we talk about sports. About soccer.
Because really, it's something trivial, superficial, just something very superficial. In the end, the phenomenon.
And where's the academy? Where's the university? Because I feel like the phenomenon is well studied in Argentina. Yeah, much deeper. Here in Chile, quite a bit less, you know. But the academy is slowly starting to show up. There are some researchers, PhDs in history, people who, since the circle is pretty small, are starting to emerge and are doing better research around sports, its derivatives, what happens, and how it impacts. I mean, think about how your country's national soccer team winning affects the way we see ourselves. Yeah, exactly.
As people, as citizens, in the economy. Let's say, for at least the next 2 or 3 months.
Uruguay is like that. A country has 2 World Cups, and I don't know how many Copa Americas. And abroad, today, a Uruguayan is the world champion. The Argentine is the world champion. Chile spent 99 years participating in the South American Cup, Copa America, without winning anything.
They never even won the Copa America.
99 years. Chile says there's no evil that lasts 100 years that didn't last 100 years. We won it in 2000.
The coaches are watching them too, who are Chilean, to see the expressions they make.
There's no evil that lasts 100 years. And the incredible thing about that is that the kids who are coming up now, who were born, or were very young in 2015, who were born from 2010 onward, they've grown up thinking that Chile has 2 Copa Americas and that they won them in Argentina. And that changes the way they see themselves as Chileans. Of course, it changes their perspective and it changes their. I'd say that in some ways, when you choose a soccer club, there's also a way of visualizing life, because clubs become forms. At the core, it's like choosing a religion. It teaches you something.
Yeah, or like choosing a pet that looks like its owner. It reminds me of racing. Chile is like racing in the world. Ha ha ha. Because, well, racing went many years without winning. Then I witnessed when they won, after 30 years, one of my best friends from school, Pablo Persico. 6 brothers, all huge racing fans. How it changed. Their own, it was almost like they had the DNA, you know, but everything that's above the somatization of the DNA. Everything changed for them once they won. It was the, in this case, it would be the family, but it could be the community, it could be the whole club of people who are carrying a karma of never winning. And suddenly, it's that vibe, right? Whatever the cup gives you, or whatever it is. And back to it, because I said, as I mentioned, like 2 or 3 times, and just to make a mention, and then I'd like you to read something about Metanoia too. But we'll move on to other topics that will come from that reading, but I don't want to skip over the topic of how it was formed or how sports, and particularly soccer, maybe in a more Machiavellian way, maybe in a more strategic, opportunistic way, or however you want to interpret it, but how? During the times when the British Empire had a big influence in Latin America, they realized, because it had happened, I'm paraphrasing, just like it had happened in the UK, they brought in sports. Different sports, soccer exploded, but they brought it in somehow to organize, to arrange, to, for example, give this illusion maybe, or this moment in the week where the poor were equal to the rich. Maybe that calmed the sense of justice, the anger. They could organize them. There was a certain exercise of power over society not just by promoting sports, but by managing the structure of sports.
I'm on a path, I'm doing okay, or yeah, but look, to understand, because it's kind of complex to say it, like you mentioned, it's a very complex thing that seems like. I'm throwing you a curveball, so you can explain it a bit. Yeah, it seems like it was some kind of conspiracy. Sure, if it were something about the anti-vaxxers. But you have to understand the state itself first, what its goal is. It's always about having better citizens so that those citizens produce and make money to sustain the state itself. Because what the state does, at its core, is try to provide a better quality of life for people, to ensure minimum standards. It's like a business. At its core, it's a business and it has its internal processes. And well, the difference between a for-profit and a non-profit organization is that one is made to make money and the other is made to spend it. That's why sometimes when technocrats come into the government and say, hey, I'm here to cut back. No, the state is made to spend. Well, philosophy and ways of seeing the world perhaps differently. But under that premise, the state, regardless of whether we see it as the modern states we have today, was also the same with kings back then. The kings, people who were raised from a young age to govern you, but the same exercise, the kings collected tributes, gathered them, and with that, they tried to maintain the kingdom, obviously with goals very different from those of a modern state or the same, but it's understood. The same way with the empire. But if we go back to the state, it's about improving its citizens or providing them with well-being. And on that premise, obviously when sports came about, which in essence comes from public schools, which translates to public schools, but in reality, they are the private schools of Great Britain where the aristocracy was educated. They realized there was a lot of violence. The teachers who were also connected to religion, over there they were Anglicans, Protestants. They were basically priests, and they realized there was a lot of violence. How do we channel this violence? Through team sports, soccer, rugby. Well, they had been playing cricket for a long time, but by the mid-19th century, they started to see that they needed to somehow channel that violence to calm that violence down. In blood, because there were gangs. The UK was also suffering from this scourge where the kids, no matter how aristocratic they were also forming gangs and running around.
Was there any way they didn't have a way to burn off that energy? It's part of their age.
And of course, these guys are brilliant deep down. One thinks of religion today as something from ignorance, but back then, the scholars were part of the church. That is, now deep down everyone was either Protestant or belonged to a Saracen region. It was the strangest thing in the world. So the priests and the teachers realized that they needed to calm this down, and they created rules and they established the concept that one thing is sport and another thing is the sportsman. It's the person to whom. One thing is sport and another thing is the sportsman. The athlete. So now what I'm going to create is the athlete, because if I can create the sport, that's fine, the rules and everything, but now I'm going to create the athlete. And that athlete, I give them a moral, ethical, and behavioral responsibility. And that's crucial. That's where it says what's important. You have to win within the rules.
Of course. First, you have to win, but within the rules, you can't break the rules. Of course.
And not breaking the rules also means being able to control yourself.
Of course, respecting others, working as a team, but also not just on the field, but in training, in the locker rooms, after hours. The whole idea of connecting with your friends, everything that sports gives you.
Exactly. So, that phenomenon, I don't know if they thought about it that much, but at the moment they created the rule and created the sport. The athlete was born. Of course. And of course, when you read the newspapers from that time, very old ones, they always talk about, oh, he's a sportsman. He's a sportsman. So it's like a quality. It's someone who has certain characteristics.
Yeah, almost like a warrior, or a knight, or a title. That elevates that individual in their moral quality. Historic.
And it also mixes with religion because this movement of muscular Christianity comes up, muscular Christianity, which basically talks about how taking care of your body is part of being a better parishioner or a better Christian, really. Basically, both Protestants and Catholics are Christians. So, under that logic, taking care of your body makes you a better Christian, and it also has a moral, ethical aspect that's involved. So, sport is born as a mix of both things.
Of course. From the spiritual to the physical. Self-control, temperance, which is very different and contrasts. within the same church.
These guys who don't eat, I can't remember what they're called, who are in some congregations, who take vows of poverty, oh right, the ascetics. The ascetics, right, basically it's about weakening yourself. Unlike, I don't know, in the East, where you have the Shabalingo monks, they're capable.
Yeah, in India there are the sadhus. It also depends.
But this dimension of taking care of the body comes into play here. So, a healthy mind in a healthy body, that's where the saying comes from. And that obviously creates a whole movement. And then comes the other part, when the club is created, because there are already 11 guys playing ball, and there are others who don't play, not everyone has the same abilities. But a community starts to form around the team. The first thing is the team, and from the team, everything else is born. And what does that community do? It replicates what you know from the gentleman's club, the men's club where you go to have your drink, which is very aristocratic, and there's a president, a secretary, and a treasurer, and the soccer club does the same thing. It creates a president, there's a board. So, hey, we need to buy the jerseys, because soccer also requires gear. I mean, with a ball. Soccer is cheap, 22 people can play with just one ball. 1,000. But when we start to move forward, what I was mentioning, the club is born, we give it names. We want colors, we go buy a jersey, so we need to get organized. And that organization means there has to be a president, a treasurer, and that's how clubs are formed. Then, your kids' club, I don't know, the time, Chile, think about Chile in the years, I don't know, 1895, the newspapers from then on, and you'll realize that the group of kids from school not that long ago created their new soccer club. And I told him, President, their kids, 12 years old. Everton, kids 12 and 11 years old. They chose a president, a secretary, a treasurer, and there were roles. It's like playing at being adults too. Sure. But it's a whole structure. And that's where we see civil society being born. Since soccer clubs today are an integral part of civil society, they come before unions and other civil associations. A soccer club exists and helps. Here in Chile, when someone gets sick, the soccer club throws a bingo, the classic thing here in Chile, to raise funds to help out. I mean, the club is a very important entity, then it becomes important as soon as it's born. I mean, it's right there. And in England, the phenomenon happens quickly, clubs form. They pop up and start to emerge naturally everywhere. So, like I was saying, since it's cheap, the 11 players, it's simple, the rules aren't that complicated. It's contagious.
It's contagious. And the soccer fever happens. And I was probably thinking, the heart of all this is, again, the competitive game. The game and the competition, there's a section in the book that talks about what's called cognitive reevaluation, which is a fancy way of saying that the difference between making an Excel sheet of your monthly expenses, which is a total drag, and playing on the PlayStation is that the PlayStation has levels, it has coins you earn, it has jumps, and it has rivals you have to get through. On the other hand, the Excel sheet doesn't offer any kind of challenge. There's no playful aspect to it, not at all. You're not competing against anything. The other one, on the other hand, does not offer you any kind of challenge. There is no kind of playful question, much less. You're not competing against anything. So, if this grats you, if you grad this is cognitive reappraisal. If you tell another story about the same thing, it becomes something almost passionate and maybe even addictive. For example, Tetris, or Solitaire, or any of these games that aren't much different from doing your monthly accounts, like making your tax spreadsheet, or whatever, except that there are incentives to compete and win. There is one good thing, it is human. It's not about criticizing the experience of competition and praising collaboration, but the premise is that competition is truly great. We've become a hyper-competitive society where the balance is off. It's good to restore some practice of collaboration, but without making it seem like participating is exclusive from competing. And it's good to maybe bring back some practice of collaboration, but without making it seem like participating is exclusive from competing.
Right, exactly. Competition is both things. You participate and compete. And when you compete, you want to win. But, as they said in the beginning, in sports, winning within the framework of the rules.
Winning the framework of the rules.
And keep in mind, never, and this is also important, if it's like the life lessons that sports give you. Some are born in better conditions than others. There are things that are natural. There's one, look, it's like you can't really say it, but it's true. Some are smarter than others, physically gifted better than others. Height, weight, dribbling, Alexis Sanchez, the guy was born with special traits. Arturo Vidal, mentally strong. I mean, these are things that come, they're right there. And I think the first thing sports teach you is, hey, yeah, participate, compete, but you're probably going to run into guys who are better than you. And that hard work can also help you get better. Players that, I would say, were born bad and built themselves up.
I would say the second lesson that sports teach you is that there's always a rematch. There's always a rematch. That is why it is important to unite in some way, with some coherence, with some cognitive reevaluation, to unite the different games in championships, in leagues, in a continuity so that it then makes sense. I mean, okay, today I lost, but tomorrow I can win. And then there, let's say, it recovers. It's like it gives a fractal that gives meaning to the whole sequence of events. And then the other thing, before we move on to something else, is the concept we talked about the other day of the third half. You step onto the field, and you even transform, because that happens a lot to many players. They transform, they compete, some win, others lose. And then what's fundamental is the reunion, the reunion. Always remembering that it's still a game that has already ended. Now it's time to keep living. And in life, to keep being at odds, to keep being angry. That's very Nietzschean, or very much like the ancient Greeks. The respect and honor towards the opponent. Back then, this was talked about in the context of wars. The kings or emperors, whoever was at war, they maintained a certain, let's say, you're not a worthy enemy to fight against me. What does that mean? These days, we're more pragmatic. So, if you're a nobody, if you're a small country, that's fantastic for me, because then with my firepower, I can make you burn. In contrast, in other times, and well, Nietzsche makes a comparison, let's say, about the topic of honor back then. The Spartan culture is almost like the epitome of this, right? In contrast to Christianity, but I'm not going to get into that mess. You were going to say something, and if you want, we can move on to the excerpt you chose to read. How are we doing? How are we doing on time, guys? One on one.
All right, look, to wrap up the concept and taking what it says at the beginning of the excerpt you read, Silva mistreats the idea that sports wipes away cultural and social differences in one fell swoop, right? Cultural and social differences, and deep down, it's like a bomb, right? That allows for social integration. That's really relevant. And of course, it's like the phenomenon of what's coming next. So, to get back to what we were talking about, clubs start to form, and then the next phenomenon happens on the field when worker clubs start to appear among the workers, among kids from different schools and various social classes. It turns out that on the field, we're all equal. And I think that's the great magic of soccer, beyond the fact that it's cheap, because some say it's cheap, because there are 22 players. No, in the end, if you want to have. While it's true you can play, the magic is that with rules, on the field, they disappear. equal conditions. And in that equality of conditions, in the long run, the workers always ended up winning. It happened like that. It happened in England. It happened in Chile. It happened in Argentina. At some point, the workers ended up winning. And that's why soccer players in general come from poor neighborhoods, because everyone there practices. And keep in mind that soccer always gives you the dream.
Sure, I can be Maradona, I can be Alexander, I can be the aristocrat or the high dictator. They already have it, like they have a bit of that thing secured. 2001 lives life with a different kind of passion, not to say, without this kind of passion, which is the dream of transcending your condition, social mobility.
But I tell you that when England sees this phenomenon, because that's how the soccer fever was, I mean the emergence of Scotland, England, Wales. There were hundreds of thousands of clubs. It was somehow normal. And then the super associations are born, one national, another from the county, etc., etc., reorganizing all this about soccer because it was gigantic and there were a ton of people getting organized, and organized people generate power. So he was the president of an association. He had some specific weight, and obviously the Brits saw within their empire how this phenomenon between 1863 and 1888 was crazy, just crazy, and they realized there was power there, and in a big way. So I become a superpower. When I bring my culture like the US does, it brings you Hollywood, it brings you. It's culture, and the Chinese are doing it too. In fact, a small country like Korea, with K-pop and all that brings you culture and has us all immersed in it. All the kids today who are 15 and younger are totally immersed in Korean culture and this globalization. But back then, obviously, you didn't have these resources. Cinema as we know it today didn't exist. No, sports. Sports were the big weapon that brought it all. And keep in mind, England tried to invade the Rio de la Plata in 1808, if I'm not mistaken, and they couldn't do it with weapons. So how did they invade? With soccer? England still invaded South America, but they did it with culture. Sure, but keep in mind, invading always has to do with the stake, with money. Yeah, in the end, what England needed was to have a better standing against Catholic countries like those in South America to get in somehow. And soccer, for sports, was the solution. In fact, it was practiced on Sundays. They, as Protestants, see it on Saturday, and on Sundays, people were in church, so they took the sport out of the church. There's a whole phenomenon around sports. In South America, there's a legend about soccer's arrival. Someone from England brought a ball. That someone got on a ship in England with a little ball under their arm, packed it in their suitcase, probably a teacher, right? And they came to South America with a little book like this, The Rules of Soccer, right? They arrived and started playing soccer with the ball, like it was just a natural thing. 1,000, and then it spread through the railroad along the different branches, and that's how soccer was distributed. That's a lie, that's a fable, an idea, someone creating the epic, and then it started to repeat. But the truth is that soccer spread through intellectual means. It moved through the networks that England had in those countries. I mean, we're talking about the Masons, the Protestant churches. Yeah, notice that. Soccer starts being practiced in schools, in British schools, where those kids teach other kids.
Sure. So, about what you were saying, how do we solve vandalism, that violent fervor that young people have? And the first experiment, as has happened, at least in the British Empire, and surely in others too, starts at home, first at home. All this relationship between the aristocracy and the working class, all this soccer stuff started, let's say, in the cities in Liverpool, in Manchester, in London, in Scotland, in Ireland, Wales. And then that started to spread to the third world. So, the first world, the third world, and so on. Well, the truth is you've given me a historical perspective. You've helped me understand and appreciate sports in general and soccer in particular, in a completely new way for me. I appreciate it because it's really an Argentine thing, soccer. And if you're not passionate about it, it can be a bit annoying with all the hype around it. But seeing it is like going back to the basics, returning to the sources, then revisiting or reinterpreting the phenomenon, how things unfolded. In fact, in the book, which I feel we don't have time to dive into anything else, unless you say you want to read this and I want to ask you a question, but if not, we can start cutting that part from the book. I kind of laugh a bit at what seems to me like a waste of talent. In that obsession to document everything, who scored what penalty, who won which match.
Statistic.
To me, statistics seems like a huge waste, just nonsense. Your work shows sports are part of anthropology and sociology. We don't all need to be statisticians, but having people like you bringing reflections and research results is crucial. And you're showing me that soccer and sports are part of what I was separating. Maybe we don't all need to be statisticians, but it's crucial to have people like you bringing us these reflections and the epic behind the statistics. So thank you, Eva. And maybe, just maybe, we don't all need to be statisticians, but it's essential to have people like you bringing us these reflections, the results of your research, and the epic story behind the statistics. So, thank you, Eva. Thank you so much. Dude, do you want to go here? Do you have any?
I don't know if you have any more than just a quote. But I really like this concept of the labyrinth, the Minotaur. In the end, it makes you reflect on anything you do in life. And the Minotaur. And also what comes after. Because this thing about embracing your demons. Understanding what how should I put it? Your shadows and accepting them.
Understanding them and accepting them. That's the embrace with the Minotaur.
The embrace with the Minotaur. And not to kill it, not to kill it. That concept for me within the book, I think, is really powerful because at its core, it's something I do apply in my life and it makes sense to me. It's like when you think of something and someone quickly turns it into something understandable through an allegory, which, well, that's the phenomenon. Here the response happens, you put the allegory, and I already have my preconceived idea. But yeah, that made a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think my way of life is really based on that. I don't know how to say it as if it were Satanism. Satanism. In the end, this thing about shadows, embracing them because they are part of you. 2001. No one is completely good. Now, I always believe and think that I don't need a dogma to be a good person. I need someone to tell me, not to kill.
You don't need someone to impose it on you.
These are things that are universal. Sure, some say they come from the divine, but since I don't believe in the existence of God, I think it's part of human nature and it happens in all civilizations, more or less. They all reach the same conclusions. So, that's definitely confirmed. So, based on that premise, I think that chapter in particular, or that part of the book where it talks about the Minotaur, really made sense to me. And the labyrinth, which is the journey, the path, you reach a point and here I am. I moved forward and everything that came before absolutely enriches the experience. I think that even when you finish, the goal in the end, it kind of loses some meaning. The goal was one thing and ends up being another. So, when you really get out of the labyrinth, you think you've achieved the goal, but you're still inside. And in my case, with this book, I really managed to get out of it. I feel like as a company, as a job, as research, it helped me get out of my mental labyrinth of how to finish a piece of work, which is super important. Because the goal, I used to say the goal is the book, to get the book out. But no, the goal is to learn everything I learned about how to finish my internal processes.
Hold on.
Acting blood. The book helped Lee grow.
Yeah, I really relate to that. The next book, as you said, is about the British influencing sports, games, and competition. How England or the UK later influenced Latin America. That will be a great book. And the issue of how England or the United Kingdom came into being later spread to Latin America. For me, that's a fantastic book. I was just saying that the book was kind of a metamorphosis for you. A journey into the unknown, but to get to know yourself and to transcend certain issues. And in a way, it led you, and while we're at it, let's mention Seb, and you can briefly explain what it's about. It led you to meet Jose Luis Fernandez and to be able to work for some time on a project that really aligns with your calling, to be a historian, to publish books, and to share the culture of sports with Chilean society. They are now about to develop and organize the first sports book fair. They're dreaming, they're starting to bring Zweikausendian down to earth, the project for a sports museum here in Chile. Am I right? Is that right?
Yeah. A lot of spoilers. Yeah, about what's coming up. But yes, that's exactly right. The book, as you mentioned, helped me meet a ton of people, including Jose Luis Fernandez, who invited me to be part of this project, which is where we are now. Exactly.
We're at the SUGEP facilities right now.
And of course, it takes you on a journey. We met in Buenos Aires, we had the chance to chat there, and then here. So yeah, it's all like you said, it's all about the journey. The journey is complete, and I was indeed working in IT, writing in my free time. And there's also the phenomenon that happens when you become an author. And I think you experienced it too, the criticism. Yeah, I think we shouldn't lose it. But also, when you pick up a book and see it full of mistakes, well, for me, to make that criticism, the book has to be written and refinished it. Mine probably has a lot of mistakes, maybe some things misspelled, maybe a few things poorly researched. I don't think there are that many, but yeah, there might be things I missed, forgot, or got mixed up. I hope it's not too many, but of course, the work was important, and it took me on a journey to finish a project, present it, and be told that it's good, to meet people, and finally be able to do this professionally. Because I'm not a historian. Here in Chile, being a historian is an academic degree. That's why we always talk about researchers. I'm a researcher. I love research. I'm passionate about sports, and I like to look a little deeper too. This thing that also comes up in your book about stepping back, to see the phenomena from a broader perspective, and not just looking at soccer, the ball, the stats, but realizing that something much bigger is happening here. Here it goes. And that essence was here at SUGEP. Jose Luis Fernandez, Coco Nazar, Carlos Gomez, the people who are here. We experience the phenomenon of sports, we live it, it transcends. And we see it from our perspective. When you look at it from a heritage perspective, you realize everything that sports has created and done over time, how it has built countries. In their identity, soccer has done that. Argentina is built on the foundations of sports, even though they often deny the British influence. It's in their essence and in their DNA. I mean, it changed the country. I think South America without soccer would be a completely different South America. That's how strongly I see it. And that superculture is something we need to research, rescue, and celebrate. And celebrate it and give it its value. Because in the end, I believe and feel that this is like to wrap everything up, and I think sports have made us better people. Sports make people better. With all the lessons it teaches you, it has made us better people.
It has made all of us better people.
What it teaches us, and how that identity is also passed down to the kids, as if it were something different. It's kind of religious too. It has its dogma, but I don't know, from my perspective, it creates people, and I love that.
That's an excellent closing, Seba. because it's the summary of everything we've been talking about, of everything you've shared with us. And to not drag it out any longer, because we've gone over time, but there's really nothing more to say, let's say, at least, for now. Thanks again, it's been a pleasure and honor. I learned a lot. I've probably learned the most from you. Let's say this is the podcast, the episode, the conversation where I've learned the most, where I really felt that way. I put myself in the position of listening and learning. So, thanks a lot. And well, let's wrap it up with a hub, the tradition. We're meeting in the middle. Result.
Yeah, I decided I want to thank you too, because getting to know you, having this conversation, opening up memories, discovering myself with the book has really been super rewarding.
Well, thanks, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was Metanoia, my love, the era of integration. To learn more about this series and find out what's coming up, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Namaskar, cheers, and good luck.